This morning, I'm going to tell you the stories of three different people. You'll be happy to know that only one of them is from South Carolina. The first story is about a beautiful teenage girl I came to know when I was in seminary. In your second year in seminary, while you're deep in this impossible theology, they very wisely send you out into the parish so that you can try to make practical use of all that crazy theology. And they sent me to this parish on the outskirts of Nashville, medium-sized church, had a grumpy old clergyman who was in charge, difficult personality, but I learned a lot from him. The church itself was filled with people who were just salt of the earth, just sweet, dear, fine people. But above everyone there, the person who touched me most deeply was this young girl named Julie. Julie was 16, blonde hair, little wisp of a girl, kept her hair always pulled back in a ponytail, freckly faced, and precious. And I got to know her in Wednesday night Bible study. In addition to serving on Sunday mornings, I taught a Bible study for the youth group on Wednesday nights, and she was always there. And Julie brought greater depth to that Bible study than anybody else there, including the clergyman helping lead it. She just had such maturity about her and such amazing theological insight. And because she'd engage at that level, it challenged those other teenagers to try to meet that level of engagement, and it made it a much richer Bible study. I discovered along the way that Julie had created a little ministry for herself in the parish. There were a couple of women in the church who were homebound, and so every single week, Julie went to each of their homes just to spend a little time, to hang out with them and chat, help them maybe with some simple tasks they were doing around the house, that sort of thing. She also had taken under her wing a 12-year-old girl in the parish whose parents had divorced just a few months before I arrived. And obviously that child was having a hard time. She was an only child, and it was a terrible divorce. And Julie just appointed herself as big sister to this little girl. Another thing that Julie did was she wrote notes to people in the parish, week after week. Anybody that she thought was needing encouragement, she'd just take time to write them a note, young or old, whoever they were. If she thought they might need a little encouragement that week, she'd write them a letter. Now, I didn't know about her letter writing until I was at her funeral. Julie had leukemia and had fought it for years. It would be in remission for months, and then suddenly it'd come back full force. And she'd be back in the hospital fighting it again with chemotherapy. It would go back into remission for some months. And as I sat there at that funeral, hearing these dear people talk about Julie, it stood out to me that she could easily have been a very angry, resentful teenager. She could have looked around at her contemporaries who were becoming cheerleaders, playing sports, preparing for college and some grand future, while she had none, and been a very resentful person. But she was not in any way, shape, or form. She just had such a gentle kindness about her, such a love for other people. She died at 18 years old, only a couple of years after I had gotten to know her. The second person I want to tell you about, you probably already know about. Her name is Corrie ten Boom. Odd name, but she was Dutch from the Netherlands, where she worked in her 30s for her family's watch company. Corrie and her family were faithful to the Dutch Reformed Church, and as part of that faithfulness, they were known in that community for caring for the poor. They would feed people at any point, bring them into their home, put them up when they were going through a hard time. When the Nazis pushed in and took over, they began to use their home as a place to hide Jews. They created a secret room that was behind this door that you couldn't see, that they created in Corrie's room, in her bedroom. You'd have to go through her bedroom to get to this hidden room. They helped smuggle Jews out of Germany. They were part of the resistance. And over the course of a few years, they helped smuggle more than 800 Jews before they were caught and put in concentration camps. Her father and her sister both died in those camps. Corrie survived, but she used her time while she was in the concentration camp to care for those who were weaker, who were frightened and depressed. She held little worship services and Bible studies, and she would go around and pray for people. When she was freed at the end of the war, she began a ministry to those who had survived the camps. She continued to do what she'd always done, to care for people who needed care, to encourage them and support them in every way she could. During that process, on 3 different occasions, she came face to face with men who had been guards in her very camp. And one in particular had been really cruel to her little sister, Betsy. And she wrote a book called The Hiding Place. And in that book, she tells you how difficult it was when she came face to face with that man to feel anything other than pure hatred. But she also tells you that by the grace of God, she was able to come to a place of forgiveness, even toward this person who had so harmed her little sister, even toward these men who were ultimately responsible for the deaths of her sister and her dad. The last story you may have heard before. I've told it in some sermon at some point. It was about a friend of my mother's. She was part of the church that I grew up in. And she's one of those people you step back and you think, how did she survive that? You know, we think we go through hard stuff until we see the life of somebody like that. She lost her first child. She was married, husband, 2 boys, lost her first son when he was 10 years old, and he was waiting just down the street for the school bus to come, and a drunk driver ran off the side of the road and hit him and killed him. 3 years later, her husband developed cancer and died. So she's lost her son, she's lost her husband. Now she just has the one son that she's bringing up on her own. He was 2 years younger than me. I knew him well in high school. Bright boy, went to college, got into medical school in Charleston, doing really well. 2nd year in medical school, he's crossing the Cooper River Bridge, going back into Charleston to medical school, when, ironically, just like his brother, a drunk driver drove over in his lane, hit him head on, and he lived 2 or 3 days in the hospital and died. Now, if I'd lost my husband or wife and both of my children, I don't know, I might have been filled with nothing but anger, hurt, resentment. I mean, you think this woman had every right to give up on God and life and people and become consumed with hatred. But she didn't, which is why she has always stood out for me. For many months after her second son was killed, she was reclusive. She was in her house. You didn't see her at all. But then slowly she started coming back to church. She remained a faithful person. And what you saw in her life over the coming years was that she reached out to anybody and everybody that lost a loved one. She had been through that horrible loss and was allowing God to use it for the good of others. Now, in each of these people, Julie, the 16-year-old with leukemia, Corrie from the concentration camp, and my mother's friend who lost her whole family, I see in them something very deep and very beautiful. I see in them a hope, a joy, a faith that allows them to persevere in the worst situations. You think sometimes, what could I handle in this life? What terrible calamity could come upon me and that I could handle in such a way that I would still have faith, still have joy, still have love? And I don't know. Could I lose my whole family and still have that? Could I be in a concentration camp and see my father and sister killed? Could I have leukemia when I'm a teenager and all my friends are having a great time and I'm not? They had a depth of faith, a depth of conviction, a real trust in God's love that carried them through. They look to me like the very sort of people Paul is talking about when he says that we have treasure in clay jars. Treasure in clay jars. This powerful, beautiful treasure in jars of clay. It reminds me of this wonderful chalice, which I love, made by our sweet Mia. And I love it first and foremost because it was made by you, Mia. That's exactly right. Yes, you did, with your own hands. And we love it most because you made it. But secondly, I love it because it's not perfect, because it's a bit wobbly, because it's not exactly straight up. It's not perfect. It's fragile. And yet, in it, week after week, the very presence of God himself in the wine of communion is poured into this fragile, wobbly chalice. Isn't that what Paul's talking about? How God uses things that seem frail and fragile and imperfect to communicate his perfection, his holiness, his goodness. You remember in the ancient world, they would make clay jars. Potters would make them, they'd be fired, and then they were used to hold precious things, usually important documents or sacred scrolls. You remember the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in these clay jars hidden in a cave. Fragile things holding precious treasures. Paul is writing today to the Corinthians because they're being misled by false teachers. They've become captivated by these teachers who apparently were pretty impressive, good looking, good credentials, well spoken, teachers who were very comfortable in the Greco-Roman culture, very comfortable in the philosophical systems that were so impressive to some in that day. But they're teaching things that were contrary to the gospel. In other words, they looked good, but what was coming out of them was not so good. And Paul says to this crowd in Corinth, he says, you know what? I realize I can't be compared to these guys. I'm not cute, Paul says, I'm not good looking. I know. I don't have, any eloquence about me. I reminded the folks in Sunday school class today that in one instance, you'll remember, Paul apparently was so boring and so long-winded in his teaching that one young man went to sleep and fell out of the window, We learn biblically and extra-biblically that Paul was short and fat and bald and had a big nose and he was bow-legged and, so there was nothing special about him. He was just a misshapen old clay pot. He and his fellow missionaries were just jars of clay. But, says Paul, it's not the container that matters. It's what's inside. And Paul says, I can offer you something greater than all the treasures of the Greco-Roman world, greater than all your grand buildings, greater than all your wealth and your statuary and your philosophical systems. Paul tells them, it is God who said, let the light shine out of darkness. And he has shown that light into our hearts, giving us the knowledge of his glory in the face of Jesus. Paul is telling them that the treasure that he and his fellow missionaries carry within their frail, unimpressive bodies is the greatest treasure in all the world. The very knowledge of the love and the grace and the mercy of God. The God who created heaven and earth, the God of Adam, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the universe, has revealed his character and nature in the person of Jesus. And Paul is saying to them, we've been allowed to see God at a depth and with greater clarity than any of the Old Testament prophets. And to know that God cares, that we matter to him, that he's aware of our lives and has reached into our lives in the person of Jesus to assure us of his presence, his complete love, his purpose, his promise for our future. And it doesn't matter, says Paul, that we are frail clay pots. In fact, he says it's a good thing. I'm glad I'm an old broken clay pot, he's saying in essence, because you know what? it proves all the more the power of God. It proves that God is at work through us, that it's not by virtue of our own abilities, our own good looks, but God at work. Paul says, if you don't believe me, if you want to see it in action, if you want to have it proved, then look at our lives. Look at us, the frail servants that we are. We've been afflicted in every way, but we haven't been crushed, have we? We're still standing. We're still preaching. We've been deeply perplexed. There have been things we haven't understood, but that hasn't driven us to despair, because we know that God's truth is being revealed day by day. We've been persecuted, but not forsaken. Our Lord Jesus has walked with us through all those tough moments. We have been struck down, but we haven't been destroyed, have we? We're still strong in Christ. We're being treated, he says, in many of the same ways that Jesus was treated, so that we identify with his suffering. But just as he was resurrected, so his resurrected life lives in us, through us. We carry his very power around in these frail, broken down bodies of ours. How else could we keep doing it? How else could we continue to proclaim hope and love and forgiveness and grace when we're being battered and hated and stoned? Again, we talked in Sunday school. Do you remember after Paul's first missionary journey, he comes back home and he tells them, I was spat out, I was stoned, I was thrown out of towns, I was imprisoned, I was, all these horrible things. And then he says, and I feel like I was really making some progress with the Greeks. He's excited. Are you nuts? Are you crazy? Man, look back over all you just went through. That everybody else would see that as failure, 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 failure. What a terrible thing. And yet, you're seeing possibility, possibility, possibility. Because you're trusting in something beyond your own experiences. You know God's in it. You know he's at work. You don't lose faith. Later in his letter, you remember Paul says that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. And I'm playing the Stephen Curtis Chapman version of that for the offertory. Such a beautiful song because it speaks so deeply, I think, to each of us, God's strength in our weakness, that when we lean on him in times of darkness and sorrow and loss, we discover a power so much greater than our own. I've been through dark times, as you know. And in those darkest days, leaning on God and discovering there a strength that it was so far beyond anything that was left in me has had enormous impact. A power so much greater than our own. The kind of power that gives a 16-year-old girl with leukemia the ability to smile and love and serve. The kind of power that gives a young woman who saw her loved ones killed in a concentration camp the ability to forgive the very people who caused their deaths. The kind of power that gives an older woman who lost her whole family the strength and desire to help others in their loss. His power is made perfect in our weakness. Leonard Cohen, the Canadian Jewish poet and songwriter, wrote that song, Hallelujah, that everybody seems to love. It is a great song, but there's another one that I love called Anthem. And the chorus of that one says, ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. There's a crack in everything. It's how the light gets in. I would say that through the cracks, not only does the light get in, but it's through the cracks that the light comes out. We are all broken. Everybody seated here is broken in one way or another. We are frail, sinful people who have made mistakes and been through loss and hurt and hardship and have suffered in ways perhaps that other people don't even know. But Cohen is right. God uses those broken places in our lives through which to bring light into our darkness. And then he uses those same broken, vulnerable places through which to shine light from our lives into the lives of others. We sometimes imagine that we can't be vessels of Christ for other people because we don't know the Bible well enough, or because we don't think we have great spiritual depth, or we don't have any great words to offer, which is the very point St. Paul is making. It is because we are just clay pots, unimpressive vessels, that God is able to use us if we will take the chance of allowing him to use us. If we will take the risk to allow him to use our vulnerabilities, our brokenness, as he chooses. 15 years ago, an unknown Scottish woman named Susan Boyle worked up the courage, took the great risk to appear on a stage in a television show, Britain's Got Talent. She was almost 50 years old at the time, a large, overweight woman from a poor family, not very well dressed or well spoken, rather frumpy and awkward. As she stood on that stage by herself, she was clearly nervous. And they asked her what she was hoping for. And she said she hoped to become a famous singer. And people laughed out loud. The cameras panned the audience, made up mostly of young people, rolling their eyes, making faces at one another, clearly thinking that this frumpy old Scottish woman was crazy to think that she could compete in this arena. And then she began to sing. And her voice was gorgeous. She sang "I Dreamed a Dream" from Les Miserables. Her voice soared across the room, easily hitting those remarkable high notes, communicating the emotion of the song with such passion. People's mouths fell open, shock and awe. As she moved into the final notes of the song, the whole audience was standing up, cheering, giving her a standing ovation. It was actually a very moving thing to watch. You can still see it online. It's worth watching. It seemed a bit miraculous that sounds like that were coming from someone so very unlikely. As her beautiful voice overcame the taunting disbelief of the young audience, rolling like thunder over their snarly faces, routing the disbelievers, it felt like God using the vulnerable, broken clay jars of his servants to sing a song of hope and truth and love, shining a light in the darkness of humanity, raising glorious strains of joy and goodness above the din of war and greed and hatred. There is something so powerful about the way God can use broken people to show forth his glorious, life-giving power if we're willing to take the risk, to step upon the stage and sing with all our hearts of his glory and his love.